Walls gleamed like they'd never known a walls gleamed like they'd never known a fingerprint. Someone was about to change your life without asking permission. He stood at attention anyway, boots aligned with glowing floor markers that pulsed faint blue, as if even the ground needed to remind him who was in charge. He had been told this was an award ceremony: valor, bravery, exceptional service under impossible conditions. All the usual phrases that meant you survived something other people didn't, and now had to pretend it was an honor rather than an accident. Miles had rehearsed the proper facial expression in the transport on the way here, solemn gratitude mixed with humble restraint. He had not rehearsed for whatever was happening now. The general cleared his throat. The sound echoed far too much for such a small noise, which Miles took as a bad sign. "Sergeant Carter," the general said, voice amplified by unseen systems that made every syllable feel like it had been vetted by a committee. "For your actions during the Tempestus border conflict, specifically your decision to remain behind and manually realign a collapsing storm gate while under hostile atmospheric interference." Miles resisted the urge to wince. He still dreamed about that storm gate. Mostly it involved lightning, screaming metal, and a very strong sense that he should have chosen a desk job. "You are hereby granted a commendation of the highest interspecies order." That part sounded good. Miles relaxed a fraction. "In accordance with treaty stipulations ratified by the United Earth Coalition and the sovereign storm courts of Tempestus, you are also hereby awarded a bonded political union." Miles blinked. The silence stretched. Somewhere behind him, someone coughed. It might have been sympathetic. It might have been stifled laughter. Miles wasn't sure which would be worse. "A what, sir?" he asked before his brain could remind his mouth about ranks and decorum. The general's lips twitched, as if they too were unhappy with the situation. "A marriage, Sergeant." Miles considered several responses in rapid succession. None of them were appropriate. He settled on honesty. "I think there's been a mistake." "There has not." "I'm not married," Miles clarified, gesturing vaguely at himself, as if this were a common misunderstanding. "I mean, I'm not opposed to the concept in theory, but I didn't fill out any forms, or meet anyone, or—" The floor lights shifted color. The general sighed. "At ease, Sergeant. This is not a request." That was when the air in front of Miles folded in on itself, light bending as if reality had briefly lost interest in being straight. A holographic projection resolved into the shape of a woman, or something close enough that his brain filed it under woman before panicking about the details. She was tall, poised in a way that suggested gravity was optional. Her features were striking, sharp without being harsh, and unmistakably humanoid except for the long ears that swept back elegantly from her head, tapering to fine points. They were not decorative. They were a declaration. Her eyes flicked across the room with practiced boredom, pausing on Miles with open skepticism. This apparently was his wife. "Princess Zephyr of the Sovereign Storm Courts," the general said, with the tone of someone reciting a warning label. "Heir of Tempestus." The princess crossed her arms. The hologram crackled faintly, static dancing at the edges of her form. "Is this him?" she asked, her voice smooth and sharp, accented by something musical and dangerous. "He looks, smaller than the reports suggested." Miles opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "I'm standing right here." "Yes," Zephyr said. "That is what concerns me." A ripple of restrained amusement moved through the assembled officers. Miles felt his ears burn. The general continued, plowing forward as if humor were a hostile force. "This union symbolizes trust between our peoples. A joining of strength and punishment," Zephyr cut in lightly. "You forgot punishment." The general ignored that too. Miles stared at the hologram, then at the general, then back at the hologram. "So let me get this straight," he said. "I didn't die fixing a storm gate, so now I'm married to an alien princess." "Yes," the general said. Zephyr tilted her head. "Alien soldier," she corrected. "You make it sound as though I'm the unusual one." Miles rubbed his face. "This is above my pay grade." "On the contrary," Zephyr replied. "This is apparently because of it." Thunder rumbled faintly through the hologram. The room's environmental stabilizers hummed in response. Miles had the distinct impression that his life had just been reassigned, and no one had even bothered to ask if he liked storms. Princess Zephyr learned about her engagement the same way she learned about most inconvenient truths, in the middle of something she was already angry about. She was standing barefoot on a balcony high above the capital of Tempestus, arguing with three counselors, two aides, and one very unfortunate weather monitoring drone that kept chiming warnings every time her pulse spiked. The sky behind her was an undecided shade between blue and catastrophe. "You cannot assign me a husband like a faulty generator," Zephyr said, her voice calm in the way that only came right before lightning. "I am not a component." Counselor Vale adjusted his insulating cloak nervously. "With respect, Your Highness, you are a symbol." Zephyr smiled. The clouds did not. "Yes," she said, "and symbols tend to fall over if you stack too much nonsense on them." The drone chimed again and immediately short-circuited, spiraling off the balcony in a trail of sparks. No one mentioned it. "The treaty requires a gesture of unity," another counselor said quickly. "The human soldier fulfills all criteria: decorated, loyal, disposable." "That last word," Zephyr said, tilting her head, "was meant to stay inside your thoughts." The temperature dropped several degrees. The aides took one synchronized step backward, professionals to the end. Counselor Vale cleared his throat. "Princess, you are admired, feared, revered. But your temperament has made certain negotiations difficult." "Difficult," Zephyr repeated thoughtfully. "Is that what you call it when ambassadors faint?" "Yes." She leaned her elbows on the railing and looked out over the storm-wrapped city. Towers glowed softly through sheets of rain. Tempestus was beautiful when it was angry. So was she, according to people who feared her enough to be honest. "So," she said, "your solution is to marry me off to a human." "A hero," Vale corrected. "One who stood alone inside a collapsing storm gate, who defied Tempestian atmospheric physics through sheer stubbornness." Zephyr snorted despite herself. "That already sounds unbearable." "He is highly respected," the counselor pressed, "and politically neutral. You will calm. He will be honored. The alliance stabilizes." Zephyr straightened slowly. "You think proximity to me is an honor?" The sky answered for her, thunder cracking close enough to rattle glass. Hours later, after the counselors fled under the pretense of urgent survival, Zephyr stood alone in her chambers, staring at the holographic projection of Sergeant Miles Carter. She had expected someone larger, louder, someone who looked like he belonged in stories told to frightened children. Instead, the human soldier on the recording looked tired, slightly confused, and deeply unimpressed by the universe in general. He stood too stiffly. He frowned at authority. He asked questions at exactly the wrong times. When the recording reached the part where he said, "I think there's been a mistake," Zephyr laughed. It burst out of her, sharp and sudden, and the lights flickered in response. "Oh, you have no idea," she murmured. By the time they finally met in person, aboard a neutral transit station balanced delicately between human space and Tempestian influence, Zephyr had decided three things. First, she would not make this easy. Second, she would not apologize for that. Third, if he turned out to be as dull as the council hoped, she might actually bite someone. Miles Carter was waiting in the docking bay when she arrived, flanked by officers who looked like they'd rather face artillery than make small talk with royalty. He straightened when he saw her, nearly knocking his head on a low Tempestian beam. "Careful," Zephyr said pleasantly. "Our architecture resents confidence." He stared, then huffed a quiet laugh. "Noted." That annoyed her more than fear would have. They stood there for a moment, assessing each other like mismatched cargo. Finally, Miles spoke. "So," he said, "Princess, soldier, is it too late to ask if this is a prank?" She circled him slowly, hands clasped behind her back. His pulse was visible at his throat. He smelled like metal, ozone, and resignation. "No," she said, "but it is early enough for regret." He nodded. "Fair." A Tempestian aide cleared her throat loudly. "Your quarters are prepared, shared in accordance with—" "No," Zephyr said at the same time Miles said, "Shared?" They looked at each other. The aide winced. "Negotiable?" Zephyr leaned in close enough that Miles could see faint sparks dancing at the edges of her irises. Do not misunderstand me, human, she said softly. I did not choose you. He swallowed. Good, because I didn't choose you either. The sparks paused. Something like interest flickered across her face. Well, Zephyr said, straightening, this is already going terribly. Miles smiled despite himself. I get that a lot. Somewhere deep within the station, thunder rolled, muted, curious, and not entirely displeased. The ship did not ease into motion so much as it committed to it with enthusiasm. Miles felt the deck hum beneath his boots, a vibration that worked its way up his spine, like the opening note of a song he didn't trust. Outside the viewport, space twisted briefly, then snapped into the stretched geometry of a Tempestian jump corridor. Zephyr watched it with visible irritation. It's crooked, she said. Miles glanced at the readouts, then back at the corridor, which looked exactly as unsettling as every faster-than-light transit he'd ever experienced. That's just how it looks. It shouldn't, she replied. Storm paths curve with intent. This just looks lazy. Miles decided this was not the moment to explain human engineering philosophy, which often boiled down to good enough, mostly safe, and cheap. Instead, he strapped himself into the nearest acceleration chair and waited for the part where his organs briefly considered relocating. The ship lurched. Zephyr did not sit. She never did when she was annoyed. She paced instead, long ears flicking subtly as if catching frequencies the ship's sensors couldn't. Every time the corridor flared, static danced across the air around her. Miles squinted. Are you interfering with the jump? She stopped and looked at him. Interfering is such a judgmental word. Actively criticizing it? Yes. The ship shuddered again, then smoothed out, as if embarrassed. Miles exhaled slowly. Please tell me you don't do that during landings. I try not to, Zephyr said. But gravity and I have disagreements. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, just uncertain. Miles broke it the way he always did, with questions he probably shouldn't ask. So, Tempestus, he said, storm planet, royal courts, anger-powered weather. Am I missing anything important? Zephyr considered him. Do you bruise easily? Only emotionally, she huffed, a sound halfway between laughter and a threat. You will survive. That's what they said about the storm gate. Her gaze sharpened. You stayed. It wasn't a question. Miles shrugged. Someone had to. That is not an answer, Zephyr said. That is an excuse humans use when they don't want to admit fear. He smiled thinly. I was terrified. She blinked, clearly not expecting that. The air calmed slightly. They passed the next hour in a strange, uneven truce. Miles learned that Tempestian timekeeping did not align with human standards, that Zephyr found artificial gravity insulting, and that her jealousy, so often cited in diplomatic briefings, was less about possession and more about loss. Things were taken from her constantly. Decisions, choices, silence. Miles did not offer sympathy. He offered snacks. These are nutrient bars, he said, holding one out. They taste like regret, but they're filling. Zephyr sniffed it suspiciously. Is it alive? Only in spirit. She took a bite, grimaced, and lightning snapped harmlessly against the bulkhead. You eat this voluntarily? We lost a war over worse. She laughed then, properly this time, and the ship's lights flickered as if relieved. When the jump corridor finally released them into Tempestian orbit, the planet below churned with motion. Storm systems braided across continents, clouds flashing with internal light. Miles felt very small. Zephyr leaned beside him at the viewport. You are allowed to be afraid, she said quietly. I know, he replied. I just prefer not to be useless while I am. The descent was loud, turbulent, and deeply personal. Miles swore he felt the planet watching them. The landing platform rose through rain so dense it might as well have been solid, locking into place with a resonant clang. As the hatch opened, wind rushed in, warm and charged. Zephyr stepped forward, shoulders back, chin lifted. The storm softened instantly, rain easing to a steady fall instead of a downpour. Miles stared. You didn't even look at it. I don't have to, she said. It listens. He followed her out, boots slipping slightly on the slick surface. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. Not angry, just curious. "Welcome," Zephyr said, glancing at him sidelong. "To my problem." Miles adjusted his jacket, rain plastering it to his skin. "You know," he said, "this still beats being shot at." She smirked. "Give it time, soldier." And for the first time since the ceremony, Miles thought that maybe, just maybe, this disaster had potential. The palace tried very hard to impress Miles, which was unfortunate, because he had long since learned that the more impressive a building was, the more likely it was to be hiding sharp edges. He followed Zephyr through corridors that shifted subtly as they walked, floors adjusting their slope to her stride rather than his. He compensated by walking like a man on a ship that refused to admit it was moving. The guards did not help. They wore armor that hummed softly, eyes forward, expressions carefully neutral in the way that suggested extensive training and even more extensive fear. "Try not to limp," Zephyr said without looking back. "I'm not limping," Miles replied. "I'm adapting." "To the floor?" "To the concept of not falling." She slowed just enough that he nearly walked into her. Her long ears twitched back toward him, amused. "You could ask the palace to adjust for you." "I could," he said, "but then it would know I'm weak." "It already knows," she said lightly. "It just hasn't decided whether that's interesting." They entered the court chamber with all the subtlety of a thunderclap. The air shifted the moment Zephyr crossed the threshold, pressure equalizing around her like a held breath finally released. The assembled nobles straightened. Whispers rippled outward, bounced off walls, then tried unsuccessfully to hide. Miles stood beside her, suddenly aware that he was underdressed, underinformed, and possibly under sentence. A tall Tempestian noble stepped forward, cloak crackling faintly with static. "Your Highness," he said, bowing just enough to be respectful without suggesting submission. "We were not informed the human would attend." Zephyr smiled sweetly. Somewhere above them, thunder grumbled. "That is because," she said, "I enjoy surprises." The noble's gaze flicked to Miles, dismissive. "He seems intact." "I make it a habit," Miles said before thinking better of it. Several heads turned. One aide audibly gasped. Zephyr's shoulders shook. "You may speak," she told Miles, voice warm with dangerous encouragement. "Since you are here as my honored consort." The noble stiffened. "Consort?" Miles leaned closer to Zephyr. "Is that good or bad?" "Yes," she said. The court proceedings dragged on in the way only political rituals could, full of formal phrases that said nothing while implying everything. Miles listened, tried to follow, failed, and eventually resorted to counting how many times someone flinched when Zephyr shifted her weight. It was a surprisingly high number. At one point, a counselor began outlining the behavioral expectations of the union. Zephyr listened politely until he reached the part about moderating emotional output. She raised one finger. The chamber lights flickered. A low wind stirred papers. Miles felt his hair lift. "I am not a malfunction," Zephyr said calmly, "and he is not a leash." Silence fell like snow. Miles cleared his throat. "For the record," he added, "I don't look good in collars." That did it. Laughter broke out, hesitant at first, then spreading as nobles realized they were allowed to breathe again. Even the counselor cracked a reluctant smile. Zephyr glanced at Miles, eyes bright. "You see," she murmured. "Useful." They escaped the chamber an hour later, dignity intact and patience frayed. Outside, the palace terraces opened onto a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Zephyr leaned against the railing, energy bleeding off her in visible ripples. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Miles shrugged. "Seemed like someone should say it." "They will not forget it." "Good," he said. "I hate repeating myself." She studied him for a long moment, then laughed softly. The wind calmed in response. "You are very strange for a soldier," she said. "You're very calm for a storm," he replied. "Do not tell anyone that." They stood there in companionable silence, watching clouds reorganize themselves out of sheer respect. For the first time since arriving, Miles felt something settle into place. Not comfort exactly, but understanding. Inside the palace, politics continued as always. Out on the terrace, a princess and a soldier shared a quiet victory, neither quite ready to admit how much it mattered. The storm began as a misunderstanding. Miles was still learning the palace's unspoken rules, most of which seemed designed to be broken only by people with the authority to survive the consequences. He had just committed one of them by accident. It started in a side hall outside the communications wing, where a human diplomat, young, polished, and dangerously enthusiastic, had intercepted him with the kind of smile that meant trouble. "Sergeant Carter," the diplomat said, offering a hand. "Ambassador Lin, I wanted to congratulate you on the union. Quite a diplomatic coup." Miles shook his hand automatically. "That's one word for it," Lin laughed. "You must be enjoying Tempestus. The princess seems spirited." Miles considered his answer carefully. "She's honest." The diplomat nodded as if this were a coded admission. Of course, of course. And how is she adjusting to the expectations of the treaty?" Miles frowned. "What expectations?" Lin's smile froze just slightly. "You haven't been informed?" That was when the storm decided to join the conversation. It didn't announce itself with thunder at first. Instead, the palace lights dimmed, the air grew heavy, and the floor gave a low, irritated hum. Miles felt it before he heard it. The pressure behind the eyes, the sense of something large drawing breath. Zephyr appeared at the far end of the hall, walking fast enough that the palace struggled to keep up. Her long ears were pinned back, and sparks skipped across the metal inlays of the walls as she passed. "Miles," she said, voice sharp but controlled. "Who is this?" The diplomat swallowed. "Your Highness, I was just explaining—" "No," Zephyr said. "You were not." The lights flickered harder. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled, impatient. Miles raised his hand slightly. "I think there's been a communication issue." Zephyr laughed once, short and humorless. "There always is." She turned to the diplomat. "You may leave." Lin hesitated. "The council may send someone braver," Zephyr finished. The storm answered for her, a crack so close it rattled teeth. The diplomat fled. They stood there in the suddenly empty hall, the palace groaning softly as if unsure whose side it was on. "What did he say to you?" Zephyr asked. Miles exhaled. "Apparently there's an expectation that this marriage comes with an expiration date." The air went very still. "He said," Miles continued carefully, "that once the alliance stabilizes, I'm to be reassigned, and you're to resume negotiations." Lightning tore across the ceiling conduits. The palace alarms chirped, then thought better of it and went quiet. "So," Zephyr said softly, "they told you." "They told me half," Miles replied. "I'm guessing you got the other half." Her jaw tightened. The storm outside the palace finally broke, rain hammering down with enough force to make a point. "They plan to return me," she said. "Contained, corrected, useful." Miles took a step toward her. "Zephyr, do not," she snapped. The wind surged, knocking him back a pace. "Do not try to soften this." She turned away, pacing like a caged force of nature. The palace struggled, walls flexing, energy shields flaring to compensate. "I am tired of being a phase," she said. "A problem to be managed until it becomes inconvenient again." Miles rubbed the back of his neck. "For what it's worth, I'm also apparently temporary." She stopped, looked at him. "That," she said slowly, "is not acceptable." Thunder boomed, closer now, angrier. Miles couldn't help it. He laughed, a short bark that surprised them both. "You know, back on Earth, this would be the part where someone suggests couples counseling." The storm hesitated. Zephyr blinked. "What is counseling?" "It's where two people sit in a room and argue with a third person who charges by the hour." A reluctant smile tugged at her mouth. The lightning softened, just a fraction. "They think," she said, quieter now, "that jealousy makes me unstable." Miles shrugged. "They think fear makes soldiers obedient. They're wrong about that too." The storm eased enough that the palace stopped complaining. Rain continued, but now it sounded less like an accusation and more like a decision. Zephyr stepped closer. "If they separate us," she said, "it will not be because I agreed." Miles met her gaze. "Same." They stood there, two prizes refusing to stay on the shelf, while Tempestus raged gently around them, waiting to see what they would choose next. The plan was, by all reasonable definitions, a terrible one. Miles knew this because it began with Zephyr saying, We will speak to them directly, and ended with him holding a tablet full of legal language that actively resisted being read. Just so I'm clear, he said, scrolling through glowing clauses that rearranged themselves when he wasn't looking. This document assumes I'm either a military asset, a diplomatic symbol, or deceased. Yes, Zephyr said. They prefer efficiency. They were seated in a side chamber that had once been used for meditation and was now being aggressively repurposed for rebellion. The walls hummed softly, reacting to Zephyr's mood like nervous animals. Outside, the storm had settled into a watchful simmer, clouds stacked neatly as if waiting for instructions. Miles rubbed his eyes. Okay, so, we go before the Storm Council and the human delegation. We explain that we're not objects. We request autonomy. Worst case scenario, they laugh and send me back to Earth in a very small box. Zephyr tilted her head. Why would they laugh? Experience. She smiled faintly. Then they will stop. They entered the council chamber together, not with ceremony but with purpose, which immediately confused everyone. The human diplomats stood on one side, Tempestian nobles on the other, all mid-argument over phrasing that no longer mattered. Zephyr did not wait to be acknowledged. This union, she said, her voice carrying effortlessly, was designed to symbolize cooperation. Instead, it has revealed cowardice. That got their attention. Miles stepped forward before his courage could reconsider. I didn't earn a marriage, he said. I earned survival, and somehow that turned into a leash for both of us. A murmur spread. A human delegate frowned. A Tempestian counselor bristled. This arrangement has kept the peace, one of them said sharply. For now, Zephyr replied. So does fear. So does silence. Neither lasts. Miles glanced sideways at her. You're doing great. I know. The debate that followed was chaotic in the most educational way possible. Lawyers argued definitions. Counselors cited precedent. A translator malfunctioned and briefly suggested everyone apologize to the furniture. Through it all, Zephyr remained calm, which made everyone else nervous. Miles leaned into honesty like a blunt instrument. He talked about the storm gate, about standing alone because orders had run out. He talked about being rewarded without consent, about waking up to find his life had been traded like a favor. I am not a treaty clause, he said, and neither is she. Zephyr's long ears lifted slightly. The storm outside shifted, listening. When the final objection came, something about stability and tradition, Zephyr stepped forward, eyes bright. Then change the tradition, she said, or watch your stability drown. Thunder rolled, not threatening, just inevitable. Silence followed, heavy, considering. At last a compromise emerged, not victory, but movement. The marriage would remain only if renewed by choice. Miles would not be reassigned without consent. Zephyr would retain authority independent of emotional metrics. Miles exhaled. So, free trial? Zephyr laughed. The storm laughed with her. As they left the chamber, Miles glanced up at the sky. You know, he said, for a terrible plan, that went surprisingly well. Zephyr smiled, wild and uncontained. Storms are like that. For the first time, the future felt less like a sentence and more like an option. The storm did not end all at once. It never did. Miles noticed that first, standing on the outer terrace days after the council's decision, watching clouds loosen their grip on the sky, as if reluctantly accepting a new arrangement. Tempestus was quieter, but not calm, like a predator resting with one eye open. You're staring again, Zephyr said behind him. He didn't turn. Just making sure it doesn't suddenly decide to eat me. It would be polite enough to warn you, she replied. Probably. That's comforting. She joined him at the railing, close enough that he could feel the familiar static in the air shift and settle. Not tense, not volatile, just present. That alone felt like progress. Life after becoming a choice instead of a condition was strange. No alarms, no urgent summons, no diplomats chasing him down corridors with revised documents and forced smiles. Miles woke when he wanted, trained because he wanted, and, most surprising of all, stayed because he wanted. He was still a soldier. That hadn't changed. What had changed was the shape of his obedience. Zephyr, for her part, was discovering something even more unsettling. Silence that wasn't imposed. Decisions that waited for her instead of trapping her. She still argued with the council, still terrified aides by existing too vividly in their presence. But the storms came less often now. When they did, they passed quickly, as if satisfied with being acknowledged rather than unleashed. You know, Miles said, leaning his elbows on the railing. Back home, people think marriage is about compromise. Zephyr snorted. It is about survival. Fair. They watched a small transport ship cut through thinning clouds, its shields glowing faintly. Human design, Tempestian modifications. Cooperation, the real kind. Inelegant, functional, slightly ridiculous. Miles smiled. So what happens now? Zephyr considered the horizon. Now the treaty stands because it works, not because anyone is afraid to break it. And us? She glanced at him sidelong, long ears flicking. We continue. That's vague. Yes, she said. I am enjoying it. He laughed, shaking his head. Somewhere behind them, a palace sensor chimed, announcing weather stability. Zephyr ignored it. Miles thought back to the man he'd been when this started, standing in a hall too clean for honesty, waiting to be told what his survival was worth. He had been good at following orders. He was better now at choosing which ones mattered. I used to think courage was staying put when everything told you to run, he said quietly. Turns out it's also knowing when not to stay where you're not wanted. Zephyr's voice softened. You are wanted. The words landed gently. No thunder, no lightning, just truth. Later, when night settled and the sky finally decided on stars instead of storms, they shared a meal that did not involve diplomats, ceremonial seating, or poison subtext. Zephyr complained about the food. Miles complained about the chairs. They both complained about politics. It felt oddly domestic for two beings once traded like weapons. As the lights dimmed and the palace relaxed around them, Zephyr stretched, electricity crackling lazily along her fingertips. If you ever decide to leave, she said, not looking at him, the storms will remember you. Miles raised an eyebrow. Is that a threat? No, she replied. A warning, he smiled. I'll take my chances. Outside, Tempestus breathed, no longer raging, no longer restrained, just alive. And for the first time, so were they, on their own terms.